The fourth volume of Open Secrets, Who Owns South Africa series, this is a series of investigations, focuses on the core administrators of private pension funds. It reveals that a small cartel of private financial institutions controls roughly 6 trillion rand in pension assets, perpetuating inequality and neglecting social priorities. The report further highlights that there's 51 billion rand in unclaimed benefits affecting 4.3 million people in South Africa as well as neighboring countries. Let's discuss this now with the head of investigation unit at Open Secrets, Mike Marchant. Mike, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for your time. So 6 trillion rand in assets managed by a small group of financial services companies. In plain language, who controls South Africa's pension funds, and should we be worried about that concentration?
Morning, Katlego. It's very good to be speaking with you again. As you've said, it was so important for us to look at pension funds as part of the Who Owns South Africa series, precisely because it's important who owns them and how they treat pension fund members and beneficiaries. But in turn, they own large parts of South Africa's economy because, of course, that's how it works. Pension funds become an important source of assets for ownership. We need to look at that sector. I think it's important to remember two things here. The one is that when it comes to private pension funds, there is huge concentration in the administration side of the business. So if we look at the 4 firms that we looked at, really financial giants like Sanlam, Old Mutual, Alex Forbes, and Liberty, they account for around about the administration of 2,500 pension funds. They dominate the sector, and very often, although they're administrators, they're very often able to pick the asset manager. The asset manager often comes from the same corporate group. And so there's often a conflict of interest there in terms of the fund administration side of the business and where the assets get placed.
Yeah.
And this has been a recurring problem in the industry for a long time. It's something the regulators and the states have been worried about. But Katlego, the other side of the coin that it is important to note is that we spoke about the 6 trillion rand in pension fund assets. The private sector is a huge player here, but we also point to this in the report. The state is also very important here because the Public Investment Corporation, which is the asset manager for government employee pension fund, the biggest single pension fund in the country, it accounts for around about half of those assets, just under 3 trillion. And so, like we've said throughout the series, we have to balance the fact that there's concentrated corporate power with the fact that the state remains an important player in South Africa's economy.
It certainly does. And the report also says that the management of these funds reflect historical and ongoing patterns of inequality and injustice. That's quite a strong claim. Maybe just give us a concrete example of what that looks like.
Katlego, I think the most telling and disturbing example of this is the 51 billion rand in pension benefits that remain owed to more than 4 million people, but remain unpaid. And this is a long-running problem in South Africa's pensions industry. It's something that the industry is very aware of. And what it really reflects is it reflects this kind of compounding injustice from what the labor and pension system was under apartheid and what it remains today. So much of the issue of the unpaid benefit issue dates back to the labor sector in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, especially in the mining sector, where the labor system was deeply exploitative. But for various reasons, that exploitation was paired with bringing employees into the pension fund system. So most mine workers and many other workers, despite being part of that system, became members of pension funds. But over the decades, both the employers, the mines and other employers, and the pension fund administrators kept records very poorly. It was lackadaisical, and the regulator really didn't intervene well enough. And so what we have now is we have millions of people in South Africa and some outside South Africa who are owed benefits, who are going to pension fund administrators and saying, look, here's the record of my employment. These are the records I have of having money deducted into pension funds. And yet pension fund administrators saying, well, we can find no record of you. And whether that's due to past historical poor record keeping, or in some instances, pension fund administrators making errors. For example, there's a history of canceling pension funds when they shouldn't have been cancelled. These problems have compounded the issue. And it means really it remains a crisis. I think it's correct to say that with over 50 billion rand owed to more than 4 million people, in the context of South Africa's equality and poverty issues, that's a crisis that the financial sector has known about for a long time, but too little has been done to address it.
And speaking of those people, I mean, also many South Africans don't have pension at all, particularly those that would be operating specifically within the informal sector. How does what happens in the formal pension sector affect those that aren't even in the system?
Yeah, Katlego, it's such a great question. It goes to the core of the report. And so, as you've said, we should acknowledge that around 2/3 of South Africans are largely excluded from the formal economy, and as a result, don't have access to a formal financial sector pension. And so that might lead some people to say, well, is the pension sector really only kind of a concern for those lucky enough to be part of it? But the answer to that is no, and it takes us back to the first thing we spoke about, is pension funds become such a crucial source of investment in the economy. Around 6 trillion rand in pension fund assets. And the question is, where those are invested have such serious consequences for South Africa's economy. And this is a long-running issue in South Africa, but also in other parts of the world, is that over time, pension fund assets that were long really crucial for the kind of boring investment in infrastructure, factories, energy, water, those things that are really crucial for the long-term growth and sustenance of the economy. Those investments have been replaced by short-termism, which links with the interests of the financial sector. You look at South Africa, far too much of our pension fund assets are allowed to flow outside of the country and directed into short-term financial markets where they chase short-term gain. And, you know, the law says very clearly in South Africa that pension funds and their investments are not just about short-term gain. They're supposed to be about the long-term interests of the fund and all current and future members. And that, you know, for all South Africans means we need to be finding ways of directing those assets into investment that build the economy in the long term and support, you know, long-term growth in such a way that would help address the unemployment and the inequality crises that we continue to face.
Mike, very quickly, I mean, you and I had this conversation last year when you released the third volume. This is now the fourth in the series. We've covered everything from mining, media, and retail. So ultimately, after 4 volumes, what's your answer? Who owns South Africa?
So the answer, Katlego, in as short a time as possible for a question like that is that ownership remains concentrated in the hands of a few small players. And we've already seen just across the first 4 volumes the continual resurgence of corporations that are linked to the wealthiest South Africans. I think of examples like Patrice Motsepe's African Rainbow Capital, Johan Rupert's Remgro. Those type of players exercise a huge amount of control of ownership across sectors of the economy, and that gives them great power. But I would say this report into the pensions industry reminds us that the Public Investment Corporation, representing the state, holds about 13% of the JSE. And we speak in the report about how it doesn't leverage that power enough. And so I guess I would leave us with that, is that we have a problem of concentrated private power, but we also have a state that has leverage and power, and it certainly doesn't use it enough to address the crises that the economy and the country faces.
All right, Mike Marchant, always a pleasure speaking to you. Very eye-opening with the series, certainly shining an uncomfortable light, particularly on those companies managing our country's pension funds.